Hi, I'm Michael Frye. Welcome to the next installment in my series of photo critiques. This time I'm critiquing a photograph by David Eaton called Mist, and this was made in a forest known as the Chase near Birmingham, England. Now normally I would start off talking about light and composition. But in discussing this photograph, I think that the processing is such an important aspect of it that I'm going to start off with that, but only briefly, and then I'll delve into the light, composition, and technical aspects of the image. Then I'm also going to add a second part to this critique, a second video, where I show you in depth how I reprocessed this image. Now this is the JPEG that I originally saw on Flickr, and when I first saw this, my impression was that it was too dark, kind of murky looking, and also that the color balance might be a little bit off. So I'm gonna just very quickly here lighten it up just to show what it might look like a bit brighter, and that allows you to also see that the color balance is very yellow. Even the mist back here has kind of a yellowish tint. Really everything does, which makes it look a little bit muddy. It makes it kind of monochrome. We lose color contrast and so forth, like all of these leaves down here. There's actually some green leaves in here, but they look rather yellowish. And this is the image after I reprocessed it. David was kind enough to give me the original raw file to work with, and I think obviously this is much brighter. I think it's livelier, and also the color balance is quite a bit more neutral. The grays here in the mist are pretty neutral, or if anything maybe slightly on the blue side, which helps to set up a color contrast between the slightly cool color here and all the warm colors here. The colors in these leaves look much cleaner and more natural. We can see those greens in the leaves here. There's also some greens that come out down here, look like maybe ferns. And all in all, I think the image just looks cleaner now that it's been brightened up and the color balance is more neutral. Now if we look at this image with the default settings in Lightroom or in Camera Raw, you can see that it's kind of on the dark side to begin with. Note that the histogram is mostly pushed up to the left, and the brightest pixels are at most 2/3 of the way up the scale here. What puzzled me about this was that David took an already dark image and made it darker. These are his settings in Adobe Camera Raw. He used Photoshop Elements, so he used the Elements version of Adobe Camera Raw and pulled the exposure down with a negative setting of 0.35, pushed the blacks up, which also darkened the image. And then he did some further processing in Elements proper. So maybe David just liked this image dark, liked the mood of that. That's always a possibility. But it also occurred to me that maybe he wasn't viewing the photograph with a properly calibrated monitor. If the screen brightness was turned up too much, he might very well have thought that the image looked too bright and wanted to darken it. And it always amazes me that so many photographers, even serious photographers, don't calibrate their monitors. If your screen isn't calibrated, you have no idea what your photographs really look like. For that matter, you have no idea what other people's photographs really look like when you're viewing them online. You might be saying, what do you mean this is too dark? It looks just fine to me, because your monitor isn't calibrated and you have the screen brightness turned up way too much. So if you want to know what your photographs really look like, calibrate your monitor. I use the i1 Display 2 by X-Rite. That's been discontinued and replaced by the i1 Display Pro. But I think you can still find the Display 2 on Amazon and probably find a good deal on it. Okay, I'll get off my high horse here and go back to talking about this photograph. Okay, we'll go back to looking at this as I reprocessed it. And as I said, I'll talk more about how I did that later. But now that we can see the image a little brighter and with what I think is a more appropriate white balance, we can talk about more general aesthetic concerns like the light and weather and composition. So first, I think the composition is very well done overall. The vertical lines of the tree trunks create some nice repetition going across the frame, which helps to unify the image. Now, of course, the colorful leaves are the main focal point. They draw our eye because of the color. And they contrast with the background both because of the color and also the lines. These are mostly horizontal or kind of curving horizontal lines here in these foreground branches, and the lines in the background are vertical. I think David did a great job of including only the most essential things. A section of colorful leaves and just enough of the background trunks to provide some repetition, while excluding potential distractions like more of the ground or maybe other potentially messy branches. So it's a nice, simple, strong composition that really includes only the essentials. Now, one interesting feature of this image is this trunk on the right-hand side that's cut in half. This is often a problem in compositions. Normally I wouldn't do that. I would include the whole trunk and maybe even some more room over to the right and some more branches coming out here. I'm assuming that there were probably more branches with yellow leaves over on the right. Now, of course, I don't know what was over there, and maybe including that would have been a big problem for any number of reasons. But here, I think this actually works, to have this half a trunk on the right-hand side. And probably it works because it's balanced by half a trunk on the left-hand side. So we have these two dark borders on either edges of the photograph that kind of frame things in the middle. And just to kind of show you what I mean, if I crop the left edge here and put a light border along that left edge, suddenly it seems kind of off. It seems off balance, at least to me. I could further crop it here and go back to having a dark border along that left edge, and now I think it's balanced better. But I like the original crop and the original composition best. So cutting this trunk in half is a bit unconventional, but I think it works here. Now, the weather and light in this photograph are just beautiful, just really a perfect complement to this forest scene. The fog adds a great mood to the image and kind of a sense of depth with the trees receding into the fog in the background. And of course, fog always adds a little bit of a sense of mystery. And then there's just that nice splash of color, and colorful subjects always look great in soft light like this. So the light and weather really complement the scene perfectly, and I love the foggy forest mood of this image. Now, technically, we've seen that the original image was a little bit underexposed, but certainly salvageable. If we zoom in, it also looks like the photograph is a bit soft overall. Certainly the depth of field falls off a little bit in the background. It's sharper in the foreground. These leaves and trunks here are sharper than the trunks back here. And that's actually okay, you know, with an image like this, since the trees are kind of receding into the mist, having them be a little bit soft is just fine. But even the foreground leaves are not quite sharp. Now, when looking at an image like this and trying to figure out, you know, why it might not be perfectly crisp, I look at a couple of different things. First, if there's anything sharp in the photograph anywhere, then that means that camera movement wasn't the culprit, because if the camera moved, then nothing would be sharp. If something is sharp somewhere but other things are blurry, then it could be that there was subject movement, or it could be that it wasn't focused properly, or there wasn't enough depth of field. Now here, if there was subject movement, we might expect that the leaves would be blurred by the wind, perhaps, but that the trunk would be sharp. And the trunk isn't quite sharp, it's a little bit soft. So that tells me that the overall softness in this photograph was probably caused by camera movement. You know, possibly it could have been focus, you know, maybe it was focused even in front of the foreground, but I think it's probably camera movement. Now, he shot this with a 50mm lens on an APS size sensor at 1/10 of a second and f11 with ISO 200. You know, the medium aperture, f11, accounts for focus sort of falling off in the background. You know, maybe f16 or f22 would have kept those background trees in focus. If he was hand holding, then, you know, 1/10 of a second is a bit too slow for that. Even with image stabilization, that's kind of borderline. So that could be why the photograph is a little bit soft overall. You know, even on a tripod, if it's not a rock solid tripod and you're not using a cable release or electronic release or self timer, in other words, you're using your finger to press the shutter button, just that slight movement could blur the photograph for 1/10 of a second. Another possible culprit is image stabilization. With most lenses, the image stabilization is not designed to be used on a tripod, and if there's any slight vibration that it senses when the image stabilization is on, it'll try to counteract that, and it won't do it correctly because it's not designed for that. So it can actually blur the picture, and I've seen this in students' photographs in workshops, where you can see a noticeable difference and the images are sharper when you turn image stabilization off on the tripod. Now, this depends on how the lens is designed, so you really have to check your own lenses and see whether they're designed to be used on a tripod with image stabilization on or off. Now, although this image is a bit soft, I think it certainly is sharp enough for online viewing or for making small prints, you know, like up to 8x10 or so. So I think overall this is a really beautiful image. I love the light and the fog and the color, and it's well composed. There are some small technical flaws, and I think the processing could be improved, but that's an easy thing to fix. But overall, I like this image very much. In part 2 of this video, I'm going to show you how I reprocessed this image. But before I move on, I want to encourage all of you to comment. You know, I always love to hear your comments about these critiques. You know, do you agree with what I said? Do you disagree? You know, what do you think about the composition and the light here? How do you feel about the original processing and the way I reprocessed it? And of course, I also want to thank David very much for sharing his photograph with us and providing the raw file. And I'll put a link on the blog so that you can see more of David's photographs. And thanks for watching.